I'm Glenn Wood.
And I'm Richard Tademir.
We're psychotherapists based out of British Columbia, Canada, and you're listening to Deliberating Practice.
In this podcast, we deconstruct everything from the foundations of therapy to its newest innovations and horizons.
We take a critical perspective on contemporary issues that affect therapists across the world. We share our own stories, both personal and professional, and sometimes we talk to other therapists too.
We hope that this podcast can be like sitting with the trusted mentor you always wish you had, helping you integrate and make sense of our complex and exciting field.
So sit back, relax, and enjoy the episode. For resources, show notes, and to work with Richard or Glenn for supervision, consulting, or counseling, go to deliberatingpractice.com. Good evening, Richard.
Good evening, Glenn.
Nice to see you again tonight.
Nice to see you too.
Very excited for our episode tonight. And I want to let the listeners know that we're actually joined by a guest tonight. We have a third person on our podcast tonight. I want to introduce Emma. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello. Thank you, Glenn and Richard. So excited to be here and terrified.
Well, we're very happy to have you, and thanks for joining us. For our listeners who don't know Emma is, like Richard and I, a counselor and psychotherapist practicing in BC. She's a registered clinical counselor, and she graduated from the University of Northern British Columbia's counseling program in 2022, just like me. She has taken specialized training in mentalization-based therapy and internal family systems and practices in a relational psychodynamic way. Emma is also a close personal friend of myself and, funnily enough, of Richard's son, Arthur. I love the special connection between all three of us. Like, Emma's not just my friend. There's sort of a way that we all sort of know each other. Emma and Richard were both at my wedding, and Richard's son was there as well. Emma and Arthur spent a lot of time together at the wedding. There's lots of cute pictures. It was really special. So it's sort of triply special to have you on tonight, Emma, for that reason too, that we could all be together to talk about this very important topic of relational psychotherapy.
Yep. Fits in the theme of relationality. Look at that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And so that's going to be our focus tonight, is talking about psychotherapy in a relational frame. Mm-hmm. So looking at the practice of psychotherapy in a way that emphasizes and focuses on and works within the context of the relationship between client and therapist, that structures itself primarily around the dynamics of that relationship. So doesn't bring in outside content, sort of focuses on the here and now. And so we're going to look at the advantages, the pitfalls, the challenges, and sort of explore that critically. But Emma, sort of an important piece that you're bringing to our podcast tonight is your own experience, because you're not just a practitioner of a very relationship-based way of working with clients, but you're also someone who's experienced relational psychotherapy and maybe has had an adverse experience of relational psychotherapy, actually. And so I know we discussed sort of starting our episode tonight with you talking about your experience, and Richard and I, and I'm sure our listeners as well, will be very curious to hear about that as a bridge into this important topic. So maybe you want to start by telling us sort of a little bit about your experience in therapy, sort of the basics of what brought you into that and what it was like to work with someone who came from a more relational frame. And I think before we jump into that, just to add an important disclaimer, we're going to be looking critically at another therapist tonight. And so we sort of want to acknowledge that we don't want to be coming from a position of sort of shaming or unduly judging the therapist in question. We're all human, and therapy is a very, 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 very difficult thing to practice. There are tremendous risks and challenges with being an effective therapist. And so when we talk about this experience that Emma has had with her therapist, we just want to acknowledge that there's, sort of the humanity of the therapist, the vulnerability of the therapist, in addition to, the challenges that Emma experienced, which are very real, and highlight the importance of bringing close attention to this topic tonight. So,
yeah. I appreciate that. Yeah, that's something I wanted to touch on as well, that, I'm not perceiving this as like a good, bad dichotomy, that we all have the potential to cause harm. And I'm hoping in this situation, that's something that this person has learned from since, and like harm was caused and hopefully there was growth.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, with that said then, Emma, why don't you bring us into what it was like for you and what you experienced?
Yeah. So it was a longer term therapeutic relationship, like several years. And yeah, like for me, I was looking for someone who was like bringing in that relational lens, and started seeing this therapist like before I was a therapist as well. And yeah, just wanted the like anti-oppressive queer who was like informed and like childhood trauma. That was, yeah, what I was looking for. And also to name too, there was a lot that I gained from this therapist around, yeah, like self-compassion and setting boundaries. And so it's just kind of also ironic that it came up in this relationship in a big way too. But yeah, so ooh, it's hard to know where to start. I guess within our relationship, something relational coming up was like the sense for me of like, oh, I feel like you hate me in between therapy sessions. And I think for her response was like, what? No, like I have this like such a huge care for you. And that was like explicitly named. But yeah, for me, I was like, oh, okay, I can kind of feel it, but that wasn't really like hitting on it. There was a lot of my own internal stuff going on there that I don't think really, yeah, came to the surface. And then this dynamic was created where I think there was, yeah, one session where I mentioned like afterwards that like it felt like she misread something that I said, and I felt really hurt and I felt really rejected. And then she was giving explanations for where she was coming from. She was explaining like her reasons behind what happened in that encounter, and mentioned like one of the reasons was like, yeah, if we had met in a different context, like I would have like love to be your friend kind of thing. And then for me, that hit something of like, oh my God, I adore her so much. Like, wow, that's actually like, there's potential for that. Like, that makes me feel so like worthy. And I had said like, oh, is that possible? Like, can we be friends? And she's like, well, like not now, but like maybe sometime in the distant future. And then was kind of like, oh, well, like, that's also probably not a good idea. Like with people with childhood trauma, like that could cause a lot of harm, blah, blah, blah. And then for me, I read from that of like, oh, I'm too traumatized to like be friends with. And also in that session, I have a journal from that time and I reread it recently. And I'm like, oh, wow. Yeah. I like kind of have verbatim things that were said too. And in that session, she had mentioned, like, I feel like you care about me so much. I feel like you know me more than a lot of clients do. And so there was just like this air of like, oh, I'm special. And we had this special connection. And then the next session I brought up, yeah, and she had also said, like, there's a part of me that kind of wants to like throw away the therapeutic relationship and like just, yeah, be friends. And then I brought that up the next session, and she was kind of, yeah, confused by that and was like, no, I don't remember this conversation. And was like, no, I would never look at clients as potential friends. Like, yeah. And then I had brought up, like, I'm confused because then you said this piece of like maybe sometime far in the future. And then, yeah, that I'm too traumatized. And then so there was kind of this thing around boundaries where I'm like, okay, what's happening here? What are the boundaries of the therapeutic relationship? And I think from my memory, the explanation was more around it's my role to like hold the boundaries. Like you don't need to know all of them and you can be messy internally and I'll hold it for you. And for me, I like was really wanting to like, okay, but what does that mean? What does this look like? What's this like frame essentially? And yeah, I think it was kind of like, well, it's such a gray area. Like neither of us will know until you hit it, I think was kind of the essence of it. So I was like, okay, that doesn't feel satisfying, but like carry on. And then like probably a year later, something like happened again where I think I was increasing sessions with her, and then my mental health was just getting worse and worse. And I think it was in a place where it was just like this like deep, like existential loneliness that feels like very familiar from like, yeah, childhood, longstanding. And I think I was going deeper into it, and she was trying to like pull me out in different ways. And then I started to lean into it and was like, well, yeah, it makes so much sense you're feeling this because like this person let you down and this person, and kind of, yeah, was trying to like, I think like validate, like, no wonder this is happening. But then I was like, started panicking internally and was like, okay, so this is real. This isn't just a feeling. I actually am existentially alone. And then she mentioned like, okay, but like, can you tell that I care about you? Like I'm here with you. And I was like, yeah, it's not the same. She's like, okay, I get that. Like, yeah, there's going to be things to grieve, that like this relationship like has to exist in certain ways. And she's like, but it seems like you're really untethered right now. And like, you need a sense of belonging. So I invite you to belong with me temporarily, like in this more acute place. And she's like, oh yeah, you can reach out to me like via email. Like there was kind of a lot of like email correspondences between two, like that was always an invitation. And then after that session, I think it was like a few days later where I was like, I think my mental health was getting worse and worse, like hadn't left the house in a few days, and emailed her. And then there was like a back and forth. And then there was another email I had sent that was never responded to, where it was like more in crisis, but also like it could have been more like hard to read, because for me, when I'm in crisis, I'm like, things are really bad, smiley face kind of thing. So I don't really know. But then I reached out the day before we had our session to be like, hey, are we still meeting tomorrow in person? Like, what's the plan? And she responded right away to be like, yeah, we're meeting. And then I instantly felt hurt right away, because I was like, but you never responded to this last email. And you said I could tether to you in this crisis. And how did you respond so quickly? Like, I feel really betrayed. And she mentioned like, oh yeah, like I totally get that. Like, yeah, I let you down and you needed me and I wasn't there. And just so you're aware, like I'm going through a lot in my personal life. I had a pretty intense week as well, like not to make you feel responsible for me, but like just to let you know what was happening. And then also like in sessions too, there'd be like kind of increased contact. We like hug a lot and things. And I think there was a session before where she had kind of like, I was crying so hard, she like moved and was like sitting beside me and like holding me for the session. And that had happened more recently. And then in this session, I went in and I was like, okay, well, like, how are you? And then she like disclosed like the major thing, life transition she was going through. So I was like, oh, okay, like you're going through this big thing. No wonder, yeah, you weren't present. And then I was like, oh yeah, like, do you want to sit beside me? And kind of, I think went to like a caretaking mode a bit. And so like, we were just like talking about what she was going through. And then she's like, how did it impact you? Or like, what was this week like for you? And so I started explaining, and then like just with our physical contact, it was getting more and more where she was like rubbing my leg. And I think my body kind of froze, and she's like, oh, is this okay? And I was like, oh yeah, it's fine. Like, just, yeah. In the confusion of it, like, I think it was like parts of me like it and parts of this is like, this feels really like this is violating boundaries. And then from there, that session, it was kind of, we were talking about like, okay, what are the boundaries between us too? Because again, I'm like, this is really hard because I want to offer like support for you in your life. And I know you're going through this and like, I can't show up for you. Like, when is like relational therapy become like harmful too? If I like, because I think for me at that point, I was like, oh, relational therapy is me knowing a bit more about you and leveling that power dynamic in like anti-oppressive kind of ways. And then I'm like, but this, yeah, this feels so harmful. Like, this doesn't make sense. And then she was kind of like, okay, you know what? Like, we can put our heads together and kind of like figure out the boundaries. And then, yeah, she's like, we don't have to do it right now. We can do it later. And then, so the next session, I was like, okay, like, let's figure out these boundaries. And I was kind of like, yeah, it kind of feels like we either go status quo, like continue, like, or another option is now I just know more about you. And that's like going to be part of our therapeutic relationship. Or like a third option, I like go get a different counselor and like, we see if we have a personal relationship in the future. Because in the session before too, she was like, oh, like, is it the kind of the feeling like that you wish I could have you for dinner tonight? Like, I wish I could, like, I wish I could introduce you to my community. Like, it really feels like the therapeutic kind of, the ethics around it have like overcorrected themselves, where like the people are too far apart, where we're just like two humans in space kind of thing. So there was a lot of like this, like maybe something kind of could happen. And then it felt like the same, like kind of backtracking as like had happened previously, of saying that like, oh, like, I'm confused where this is coming from for you. Like, for me, the therapeutic relationship feels like the most pure form of a relationship. Is that not how it feels for you? And then I like burst into tears at that point, because I was like, this is just happening again. Like, I just feel so gaslit. And I think I was crying and just saying like, I feel so like, I feel like I'm just getting rejected over and over and over again. And she mentioned like, hey, Emma, like, I think we're in an enactment right now. Like, and I was like, okay. And I was like, no, something feels really like wrong. Like, something, I feel nauseous. And she's like, you know what? I think this is really important we stay in this, because otherwise this dynamic's just going to keep showing up again and again in your life. And then at that point I was like, hey, like, I feel like you're putting a lot on my attachment wounds, not really looking at your part in this dynamic. And then she was like, what do you mean by that? And I like tried to explain. She's like, okay, I can take accountability for like a year and a half ago when I said that other thing, but like last time I felt really internally clear, and I'm sorry that wasn't clear to you. And I was like, okay. And I was like, okay, let's just make this really clear right now, so we're not going to have a personal relationship now or ever. Is that correct? And she's like, yeah, that's correct. And I was like, okay, thank you for like making it clear. And then I think, yeah, I like noticed the session time was over. And I'm like, okay, we're done. I remember I was the one who ended it. And then as I was getting ready to leave, she's like, look, Emma, like, I'm going through a lot in my personal life right now, and this isn't the time to start loosening boundaries in other areas of my life, because like, from what I know from experience, that can cause like more harm than good. So like, let's talk about loosening boundaries in the future. But you just said that we're not going to have a personal relationship, and this is, and then it feels like it's put on to me again. From there, I think that's when I was like, okay, this, like, I need out. Yeah. And then had to end the therapeutic relationship over email, unfortunately. But yeah.
Well, Emma, thank you for starting the episode by sharing that difficult experience of transgression, everything that you just shared about the important experience you had and difficult experience. That must have been very hard. I think it provides a rich substrate for us, though, to sort of bridge into our topic and to talk through the many important points that we want to tonight. Maybe before we do that, though, we need to sort of start with the foundation here and just talk about what it means to practice relationally and sort of define that for our listeners. Should we give that a shot?
Sounds good.
What does that mean to you guys, the idea of sort of a relational psychotherapy practice?
Yeah, what it means to me is perceiving the therapeutic relationship as a microcosm for the other relationships in our outside lives. And yeah, using the therapeutic relationship kind of as like a playground to really, see what's happening and being able to work with it in time as dynamics play out.
So, Emma, I hear you sort of leaning from a more traditional psychodynamic lens. The therapeutic relationship is kind of a microcosm of the person's sort of inner object relations, right?
Mm-hmm.
Richard, I know you come from a little bit of a different place than Emma and I, though, around this work, but that you're still very relationship focused. What does it mean to you in your practice?
Yeah, I think it's the person of the therapist is looked at. I guess it's about this idea of that the real relationship. So we are two humans encountering each other with all of our baggage and feelings and the affect, the somatic, all of that. And I don't think that is something that is exclusively, exclusive to relational psychotherapy. But I don't know, when I think about relational psychotherapy, there's a certain messiness to it and there's a certain beauty in that messiness. But I think Emma's story is a great example of if we aren't really grounded in theory, we are grounded in ethics and supervision and continually working on that. It's just so easy. I don't think the therapist, was intentionally trying to obviously destroy boundaries and hurt you. Like, I don't get that sense at all. I get the sense that there was, as we see in in most ethical issues, there's this slow degradation or a cascade of kind of compromises over time, little like micro decisions that are made, and maybe we're not even aware that those are decisions.
Absolutely. I sort of like the way you lean into this, Richard. I think sometimes we think of therapy as this sort of awesome exchange of ideas or as this magical process of the therapist sort of doing to the client.
Yeah.
But I like just the way that you constructed it as simply like, I'm relational because, I consider myself a human relating to another human. And I sort of see that as essential to the therapy process. That's not something I can really exclude from it, right?
Yeah.
That reminds me, well, I want to hear your answer to this too, Glenn, but I'm going to plug the book that you recommended, The Essential Psychodynamic Psychotherapy and Acquired Art. Yeah. By Teri Quatman. But how she describes it as like the soup in between the people too. And it's like, so you're both coming in with, your experiences and they're going in the middle and you are kind of trying to figure out like, what's the client's, what's mine, what's both of ours. So just,
I like that soup metaphor.
It's a good one. It's a mess. Yeah. And that was your word, Richard. And I think that makes sense too, right? Like you're dealing with a lot of uncertainty and the sort of substrate or the content or the focus of the therapy is something kind of unclear. I know Teri Quatman also uses the idea of the swirl, which is good too. Like that it's like things move and they suck you in. Yeah, I think, I relate to this idea in a similar way to Emma. Like I think about my position is sort of informed by sort of psychoanalytic theory, psychodynamic theory, the idea that, we sort of have a set of inner object relationships that become transposed into other relationships, and that the relationship with a therapist provides a sort of unique opportunity to confront and explore and work through that in a way that other relationships wouldn't. I feel like I'm also really inspired by Carl Rogers, though, and the person-centered orientation, which I think is also essentially relational. Just the idea that like therapy be about the client experiencing themselves and the therapist sort of providing their service by just relating well to the client, like reflectively engaging with the client, sort of holding them and then handing them back to themselves, which is like a metaphor that I used a lot when I was in my practicum training, sort of the focus on empathy. And so, I think Rogers used the relationship a little bit different than some analysts do, and then the psychodynamic frame does, but also effectively, right? So yeah, so I sort of lean into it that way too. I think all of us are sort of touching on the idea though that when we practice relationally, the focus of the therapy process or encounter becomes the way that we relate to the client, the way the client relates to us, the relationship between the therapist and client. And whether that's sort of a facet of or the center of the therapy, it's important. And so we sort of take it seriously and we use it, and it becomes a vehicle for transformation.
It probably is the center, with
Yeah.
relational psychotherapy, that, as your therapist mentioned, this idea of enactment is pretty important in relational psychotherapy, that these are what is happening in the room has happened before and is still happening in other relationships. And so if we do relational psychotherapy well, we have a chance to even, and Sue Johnson talks about that, and I would categorize her in also the relational psychotherapy field, that we have a chance to even move towards secure attachment if done well. And RIP Sue Johnson, you were a huge impact in our field.
It's funny, I was just thinking about her as you two were talking to, like, I went to the BCACC conference last November, and she was discussing with clients too, like there was one client she showed who would kind of want to move away from the relational work or like to something else, and would be like, oh, let's look at the plant behind you. And Sue would be like, yes, now back to you. And so it was fantastic. Yeah.
She was a master.
I think the way that she linked or just espoused attachment theory in her work and rooted her work in attachment theory was so important too, right? That she saw EFT as a way of addressing the kinds of dynamics that get structured in early and important and essential relationships, right? I think for me, one of the ways it feels like necessary to practice relationally is because I think that as people, we are essentially relational. Like I think that human beings are essentially relational animals, that we exist relationally. That's not really something that can be extracted from our essence in some ways, right? But I think also like the problems that we experience are essentially relational problems. I know that there's an ongoing debate about what the nature of our problems truly is. But, my perspective is that the kinds of challenges that bring people to therapy are ultimately relational ones, whether they're a relationship within oneself or a relationship with another person, that they ultimately have a kind of quality of existing between two things, right? There's not just sort of a singular mechanism that fuels a problem, right? I don't know if I'm saying that well.
Well, it brings up Martin Buber's idea of I and thou. That's what comes up to me right away. Like we are defining ourselves in relationships. So I am my mother's son. I'm a father of a toddler. I'm a psychotherapist. These are really critical definitions to forming the self, but they are derived from our relationships.
We don't really understand ourselves outside of our relationships to other people. Yeah. You can argue too that, like the very structure of our psyche is relational. We rely on language to construct ourselves, to symbolize our experience, and to communicate ourselves to other people. And language is as an essential social function. So, even the way that we relate to ourselves is, well, even as I say it, relating, right? But the very way that we operate psychologically is relational. So we sort of say that relationships are at the bottom of this, right? So it's like, how could we practice therapy if we're not practicing in a way that honors that relationship is at the heart of who we are?
Yet I think a lot of therapists, unfortunately, are not including the relationship enough and the impact of relational dynamics enough, right? We've talked about this even preparing for the episode, that CBT, for example, it becomes a technician and an object that we are now, if only we can switch your distortions off or channel them into some healthier piece, right? By using these particular cognitive challenging techniques. And obviously CBT has some great benefits as well, but any therapy practice without a relational lens or a good understanding of the impact of myself as therapist on the client and vice versa, well, it's we ignore that to our peril, to everybody's peril.
Yeah. It just makes me think too, like I'm seeing a Lacanian psychoanalyst now, and the way she describes like relational therapy and like Lacan is like, she's like, I show up as a function, I'm not a human. But it's interesting how it's still relational in the way of like, okay, I can tell you're like really listening to me on multiple levels, even if I'm not getting any facial expressions. This isn't attachment work where I can't sense like warmth or, yeah, like just kind of facial cues in like an attachment way. It's interesting how it can like function so differently, but yeah, still have an impact. I mean, yeah.
By being truly listened to and truly seen. Yeah, that's amazing.
Well,
Yeah.
it's an important commentary on what we do too, right? That yeah, we relate, but the kind of relationship you have with your therapist is not the same kind of relationship that you would have with another person. That there's a unique quality to a relationship with a psychotherapist, and there should be, right?
What's different?
Well, for one, I think there's a power imbalance, right? There's a necessary imbalance, but and also a focus imbalance, right? Because the attention is on the experience of the client, not the therapist, and the person of the client, not the therapist. And so for that reason, it's not that it's not a bidirectional relationship, because it is. And I think that's sort of the concepts that we will want to start leading in as we break this down, is like the client impacts the therapist. The therapist has to sort of feel the client, but like everything goes back to the client. They're not equal in the room with the client. Like there's not an exchange in an egalitarian way, the way there would be with, say, a friendship or another close intimate relationship, or even a professional relationship or something like that, right? It's about the client.
Yeah, that reminds me of like with, this is something that's really hard for me, but I'm like trying to perfect it more and more in my practice of like, if someone's upset with you and of like with a client therapist relationship, of having to hold back there was a totally innocent reason for why I was late, or this, that it wasn't because I don't care, and having to hold that back and be like, okay, what was your experience like of that?
Right.
And yeah, this isn't actually about me or what was going on for me in this. That's
Right.
yeah, not going to be meaningful for them.
Yeah, normally we bring our own experience into our relationship with our friends, with our loved ones, talk about ourselves.
Yeah.
But it's a contentious topic or a controversial topic to talk about yourselves with your client, right? It's something that is not always warranted or appropriate.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
I just want to bridge back to another piece that Richard said too. It's sort of where relational psychotherapy fits in the contemporary milieu, and how, yeah, there are a lot of modalities that don't privilege the relationship. And I think a part of that is that, like, you know, practicing relationally is like kind of seen as this, I don't know, it's like a unique thing, right? Like, whoa, you're doing that? Whoa, that's that's crazy. Or, just some people see it as woo-woo, maybe. I don't know, or it's sort of like, what's the word I'm looking for? A little bit hokey, maybe. Like, I think that it can be controversial. Some people can sort of question the validity and the value of working relationally. There maybe isn't the same degree of empirical validity around relational orientations as there are with, say, behavioral ones. And because of its nebulosity, it scares therapists, right? Or it sort of it challenges them on a different level, right?
Well, it requires a lot of vulnerability, and also it's very risky, because again, the more that you are sharing about yourself, or even if you're not sharing that verbally, showing up, I guess, right? Examining your emotions, examining your somatics, and having that there so present, it's very tiring, I think, for therapists. There comes with a cost to it, and then also potentially great benefits too, of, as I said before, maybe work on shifting attachment dynamics for the client, or give them examples of what a quality relationship could be, so that could be practiced. The idea, I think, is that it should be practiced so that it can go into everyday life. Not that now, unfortunately, like with Emma, that we're just going to take what's happening in this room and just continue, like the therapist now becomes the friend. It's totally different than what it's meant to be.
Yeah. So that attunement of, okay, I'm sensing what the client is maybe desiring from me, and then holding of like, what am I going to do with that information? Yeah. Like that's so hard to distinguish sometimes.
Right. I sense them, I hold them, and then what do I do about it? Or what do I do with it? Yeah. And that's our burden. That's our side. That's our responsibility.
Oh yeah. It's a big one.
Yeah.
And if we're not good at managing that burden, right? Obviously, your therapist really probably could benefit from more therapy. There obviously was a lot of stress in their life. There's, that's the risk. I guess the risk was revealed to you very personally and very deeply, that if we don't manage our own shit, then it is going to spill over onto everyone.
I think one more appeal to me too around the idea of relational-based psychotherapy, relational psychotherapy, is just the idea that because it differs so much from some of the other conventional orientations, it sort of provides radical or subversive opportunities. One of the critiques that Richard and I often float around some of the behavior-based therapies is how easily ideology, like capitalist ideology, can be embedded in them.
Yeah.
How they provide an opportunity to sort of reinforce an ideological split in a person. And I feel like the relational orientations sort of do the opposite, right? They expect a kind of deinstitutionalized relationship. Like I think about Carl Rogers, right? And his conditions. There wasn't a lot of room for ideology, right? And he was heavily influenced by Otto Rank, who was a relational psychoanalyst, a kind of diverter from Freud's theory in some ways, but someone who really heavily emphasized that as well, right? That the relationship with the client needs to be clear of the kind of ideological splits that would ask them to fragment themselves, right? And so I think that's something that we offer to people. It's sort of unique. We offer a relationship where there's no sort of implicit expectations that the person be anything other than what they are. They don't have to split themselves. They don't have to sort of work against their own being, the way that we're all encultured to in the interest of the wider society that we belong to.
Yeah, with the behavioral therapies, it's a focus on functioning, right? How can I function? How can we move the person to functioning better within society, right? So in that way, we are kind of allying with society, and unfortunately, all of its dysfunction too.
This is again in the Teri Quatman's book of like, okay, but this is for the relational pieces of helping people become more fully human, of truly feeling the depth of all their experiences.
And that might be very countercultural. That might mean, going beyond the grief period that the DSM would specify, for example. Right.
To be human is to be sort of full of contradictions, contradictory experiences and conflicts. And that's something that's sort of dismissed in our society or pathologized, right? We see the conflict as a problem. We don't see it as something essential to the condition of being human.
The behavioral therapies almost in a sense are, how can we maybe not even focus on the conflict, right? Give a skill to improve functioning and maybe hope the conflict goes away, or just kind of ignore it. Unfortunately, that's where a lot of times, particularly people that have complex trauma, the behavioral-based therapy, it reaches a limitation pretty quickly.
Yeah. It's therapy that takes a side and sort of, picks a side in the conflict and tries to buttress that.
The side of getting back to work, maybe.
Yeah. Or just getting better, or doing better, being more functional, optimal, whatever, right?
Yeah, that's where relational feels so anti-oppressive too, of like, wow, being fully witnessed and able to express yourself in a space with another human and being able to feel so deeply into your pain, of like, then you can witness it and really be present for others too. You're not cut off to that in the same way.
It's so much less performative.
There's sort of like a total acceptance is embedded in the basic structure of the therapeutic process. Who cares if you're not well? We might start with, right? Like, so it's okay to be unwell. So we've been making reference, Emma, you've been making reference really to the book Essential Psychodynamic Psychotherapy by Teri Quatman. But I think that it's a good book to reference for tonight's episode because she does a really good job of sort of describing and discussing important concepts that will help us understand, what relational psychotherapy sort of is in a dynamic sense, and why it's so hard, like Richard, you were talking earlier about, the pitfalls, the challenges, the difficulties with doing it well. And I think that some of these concepts provide an answer to that, because it involves a vulnerability on the therapist and the client's part. It involves a kind of interlocking of relational worlds. And that's where things get messy, right? That's where things get messy. So I just like her basic idea at the beginning, the idea of the book, sort of the idea of the satellite dish, that like as therapists, what we are, and like kind of bridging off your analyst idea of the function, one of the basic functions that we provide is we're like a dish, and we just catch the particles of the client. Like we just sort of let them touch us. We let ourselves experience them, like somatically, emotionally, verbally, psychologically. And that's sort of our role, right? Our role is not to like assess by some rubric. Our role is not to, fall into some other frame of relating. It's just to be touched. So I'm just curious what you guys think of that, because that's kind of, to me, that's kind of an interesting concept, like sort of start there.
Yeah, I think I'd mentioned like after really like reading it and like letting it like soak in with me with clients in that way of just noticing so much more, like, I don't know, like physical sensations too. I think I mentioned with a client where I was feeling this clenching and just kind of noticing it myself for a while, and then eventually asked like, hey, what are you feeling in your body? And then they mentioned like a clenching feeling. So okay. And then we were kind of talking, and then I felt like the clench, it started unclenching, and then it doubled down and got a lot worse internally for me. And then so I was like, oh, I just want to bring your attention back. Like, how are you doing in your body? How's that sensation? And they're like, oh, it feels worse. And they're like, there's something I want to talk about, but I'm not ready to yet right now. That really showed me, because I think for me, that had always felt like, oh, this is me clenching. I'm not feeling something. This isn't like a mirror neurons thing happening where I'm picking up on something. And that, yeah, really illustrated how powerful it was. And in that moment, it did feel like mine, but I was like, okay, this is, yeah, in the soup.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
That's such a good example. I think kind of just an amazing thing you shared, Emma. And the value of this, right, is that you really learn something about your client by virtue of referencing your experience of them, right? That like by letting yourself be touched, you really gathered a level of data about the experience of the client that you maybe couldn't have received any other way.
Yeah.
And how important for both of you to be able to get to that level, to at least be able to touch on the truth of that experience.
It's important, and it's not an easy thing to do. I work in some medical settings, and nurses will often talk about, and I've even done some counseling skills training for medical staff and things like this, and they will talk about, well, I just can't get that close to patients because then I will burn out, right? It's just too much, right? And interestingly, the research on burnout and kind of this moral distress that can happen is actually kind of the opposite. It's saying that if we lose empathy, like if we don't allow ourselves to be touched by the client's experience, including suffering, we'll also be cut off from joy, we'll be cut off from mutual human experience and connection. And so what, I can think about nurses and doctors in settings like whether it was the Ebola crisis or other, persistent chronic stress settings where they're having clients or patients that are dying. And of course, it makes sense that it's, you don't want to connect with this suffering. You're seeing so much suffering and it's happening so quickly. But in that face of suffering and kind of a loss of control, like there's these cases where there's nothing you can do about it except kind of be a midwife to that person's death in a way, right? Make them as comfortable as possible. And knowing that the patient isn't getting better, right? So it becomes this focus on now my normal tools of, being able to be a surgeon or being able to give this medication. And now the patient improves and now I feel better because my patient improves. Those are not available to you anymore, right? And so your tool set is no longer a fix, right? This, tool set of, you must detach. It doesn't fit. It really hits a person hard. And instead they're thinking, no, I felt too much for the client. And, I was just too close to the client. And it's so funny how we can get things backwards.
I love how you reference that research that sort of reversed the logic. It's actually, if we fight this propensity to open ourselves and receive the experience of another person, that's when we run into problems, when we sort of conflict it. But when we allow it and we take it in and we keep the door open, then we can do well.
And we process through it and have supports around it and all of that.
I know in the context that I work in, it's extremely hard, right? Because, we work with patients with cancer. The level of distress, can be very difficult. The level of hopelessness and despondency can be very, very challenging. And so we've got to take our time with that, right? And I feel that, like, there's many days where I just feel, absolutely rocked, right? Because I'm just working with difficult content, but we cleave to each other and we get good supervision and we talk about it, and it allows us to go on. I'm just thinking about a conversation I had with my supervisor, I think sometime last week, because she sees patients as well, and just talking about how she's sort of newer to our team, and so she's kind of gotten over the hump of idealization, if you will, and sort of into it now, and sort of appreciating, oh yeah, it's just all cancer, and cancer is shitty all the time. Like at the beginning, maybe there's this sense of hope, oh yeah, I'm going to help people, and then it's like after you've met your 30th 40th client with cancer, and they're bringing the same felt experience, you're like, oh yeah, this is hard, this is hard. But yeah, I think we have to work to keep the doors open, right? Because it's through the doors that something can happen.
Yeah, to differentiate too, hey, like when it's starting to feel the same of like, okay, what's the unique quality too with that satellite in each.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I like my context because that's been my experience. It's like, yeah, I work in a context where you'd think maybe the issue would be the same every time, but it's not. It's okay, cancer is hard, but it's why it's hard is very different, and it's been interesting to sort of lean into that more and to see all the different dynamic ways that people suffer as a result of disease. And there's parallels, obviously, there's sort of trends, if you will, but yeah, I mean, you really can't understand a person's unique suffering through generalities, and everyone's different. Everyone has their own unique experience.
Yeah.
And why would the client trust you too if you can't be in the suffering with them? Brene Brown talks about empathy as the ability to be in the pit, not just stand above the pit and throw Oreos down there or throw a ladder. As much as you would want to throw a ladder down there, before we can do that, we have to be in the pit with the person. So it's no wonder that being a therapist is a stressful job. It's a hard job. It's also the most rewarding job, I think, that we wouldn't want to go down into that pit, because it means that we're encountering all of our hard stuff.
Yeah, I think we know when our therapist's satellite dish is not aimed towards us, or when the door is closed, right? You can feel that, and it's like, who would want a therapist that that doesn't receive us?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that just makes me think of the temptation to want to fix too.
Yes.
Yeah. And sensing from the person too of like, but aren't you going to do something to make this
there
better?
Is the pressure from the person
yeah.
as well.
Yeah. So that again, the attunement, and then of, okay, what do I do with this information? How do I sink into this?
Yeah. That's a really good segue, Emma, into transference, right? Because of course, what patients send at us is not just neutral information for us to receive, right? It's subtle demands about how we relate to them. Patients ask something of us. They transpose a certain structure over our relationship, and we would call this transposition transference. Yeah. And that's sort of a relational concept that's really important, right? It's important because, like you referenced earlier, this is how we get at the sort of structure underlying the person's relationship with themselves and relationship with other people that might be causing them problems or suffering in their life, right? Having this transference in the room and on us is really helpful. It's really important, because then we can name it, we can reference it, and then we can bring the client's attention to it and start to work with it, right? But it sort of puts us in a difficult position because, clients will ask us to sort of be something, right? They don't just send information to the dish that is sort of neutral or whatever. It's normally like, you have to be this way, or you have to be that way, or fix me, is, I think, a pretty common transference, right? Seeing the therapist as a savior or a hero or someone who can make the problem go away, and sort of demanding that we relate to clients in a way that addresses or fixes the problem.
The medical model and things, of course.
Yeah. And then we can sort of bring in the sister concept to that, which is countertransference, which is the kind of response that transference evokes in us, right? That we're not neutral to that experience of something being asked of us. We often relate to it in our own way, right? And the demands or the impetus that the client puts on us can evoke our own sort of structure of relationships, which can be transferred back onto the client. And so that's sort of the classical definition of countertransference, that our stuff then gets brought into the relationship, right? The client evokes sort of our sense of stuff. But I think I really like this idea of, in Teri Quatman's books, of countertransference 2.0, that there's another way of looking at countertransference, which is it's important data, right? It also says something about the way the client relates, right? Because the kind of feelings that we have can be sort of correspondent to, or can be a kind of data that we can also reference to help us move into this relational realm, right? And sometimes the feelings that we have aren't our stuff, but we still have them. Again, that's kind of data that we can use to move into the relational dimension with patients or clients.
Can we try to give an example in some way?
Yeah. Emma, do you have one?
Hmm.
I'm sure you do.
I'm thinking of working, with clients who, I don't know, like if I validate an experience of like, oh, that sounds like that was really hard, and getting it kind of to me feels like it was batted away of like, no, like it wasn't that hard. It gets like minimized in a way. And I'm like, okay, noted. And then later, like having a client say like, hey, like I wish you would validate how hard this was for me. And sitting with that of like, okay, I can tell like, yeah, on the surface of you want me to make this feel better in a way of like make it feel like a balm in a way of like this isn't painful anymore. And for me, I was kind of sitting with that of like, oh, I had kind of reflected and validated and that had been bat away previously. So do I just kind of give the, oh, it is really hard, or kind of slow down with this and be like, hey, what's happening here?
It seems so like it's something we talk about all the time in graduate school, but there, the typical example that I think graduate students learn about is something like a client shows up. This is counter transference, let's say.
Yeah.
So a client shows up, or it could be either way. So transference. The client the main differentiation, right, is transference is really about the client's feeling.
Yeah.
Right. Countertransference is about our
feelings
as therapists. So the client shows up and they start interacting with us, maybe in a rebellious way. They're cheeky, they're maybe shooting things down that we're bringing up. Maybe we give a piece of insight and they're taking it as a criticism, and perhaps they're carrying out the same dynamic that they would have with their father, let's say. Right. So I think a lot of times we teach the really basics about transference. Oh, this client was reminded of their father or mother or another attachment figure when they saw you, or there was something that you did or said, just by being yourself as a therapist, carrying out therapy, that evoked, or triggered them into this enactment, I guess, into this transference dynamic. Or there's something about the client, right? We maybe have a client that comes in. I can think about an example that one of my students brought up, that they had a client came in and they were in their 50s and they had a mega hat, right? The Make America Great Again hat. And, they have an uncle that there is a lot of negative dynamics with, right? And so right away, they're like, can I even counsel this client? They're kind of feeling emotionally cut off from this client. And the client obviously can start to tell that as well, right? And I think it's important to recognize that very often both of these dynamics are happening at the same time in a kind of cyclical loop, right? That if we aren't aware of it, it will worsen over time.
Yeah. I like your example. That's a good classical example, right? Of a quality of the client that sort of triggers our own sense of vulnerability around a particular relationship. Maybe we experience the client in a particular way that's not actually endemic to them, that's endemic to another relationship that we've had with someone else. But then we're the ones sort of transposing our own structure over them, and we relate to them in a way that sort of is defensive of that or whatever, right? I feel like I've got maybe an example brewing in my mind of like the distinction between countertransference 1.0 and 2.0, though, to kind of extend beyond the classical definition. The example I'm thinking of is just a countertransference dynamic that I've experienced a lot over the course of my career, which is there's a particular type of client that I struggle to relate with well. And it's a client that struggles to relate with themselves well, right? And my personal countertransference has been that sort of, I love therapy. I get a lot out of it. There's a lot of my own personal gratification in therapy. And there's sort of deep vulnerability around that, actually. That's something that I've had to sort of learn to pay a lot of attention to, that I kind of need the work in some ways, right? It sort of fills me up in a way that other things don't, right? And so when I am relating with someone who really needs to take their time or is ambivalent about relating with me and receiving something from the therapeutic relationship, it can evoke a strong countertransference experience in me. I can start to relate to the client in a way that's defensive of that. I can push them, I can, add a lot of pressure, or I can get frustrated, things like that. And so that's sort of the countertransference 1.0 dimension of it. But if I sort of bracket that, sometimes there's still a level of emotional reactivity on my part that actually says something more about the client and the way that they relate to other people. There's a kind of truth in this, which isn't about me, it's about them, right? Maybe a little bit of my frustration is actually warranted because the client is actually being defensive to me. They're disguising a dimension of their experience and keeping me out of it aggressively or passive aggressively, right? And so I've learned to appreciate that there's a level of truth in the feeling, that not all of it's mine, and to sort of use that as a way of bridging the topic, right? So, in a way that's much gentler than the countertransference reaction that from my own place of vulnerability that I'd want to enact, right? That's a more tempered and appropriate to a therapeutic frame, like just, hey, how is it to be here? Or, I'm wondering if you're experiencing some anxiety about coming here today and talking to me about what you'd want to talk about, right? I don't know if that's always what I say, but something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in a sense, you're inheriting the dynamic that they might be doing in other areas of their life, and they probably aren't even aware of this. There's an energetic impact on you.
Yeah.
And it feels so visceral. It feels like, oh, actually, this is my stuff, right? And this, how dare this client, and I'm getting angry and all of this.
Yeah.
Perhaps the client themselves are angry.
Or even just resistant. Like, I imagine that other people also get frustrated with them sometimes.
Oh, indeed,
yeah. Mm-hmm. And I can sort of use this as data to help me understand the kind of impact that this person generally has on relationships with other people. And
wouldn't Yalom refer to this kind of as immediacy, or it's a parallel concept?
So. Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Right. The idea of relational immediacy is embedded in the concepts of transference and countertransference, right? It's about addressing those exact dynamics and the mutual experiencing of both parties in the room. I think it's important to acknowledge, because sometimes, like in the classical definition that you shared, Richard, there's this idea that we ought to get rid of countertransference. And I think the importance of something like a countertransference 2.0 is acknowledging that we can't ever really get rid of all the countertransference, and that we actually kind of need countertransference. If we're going to leave ourselves open to receiving the client, stuff's going to end up inside of us, and it's going to be a soup.
Yeah.
Like Emma
referenced. With the soup too, of that, it's like, okay, you can be collecting this data, it can go in the soup, and that doesn't mean that you have to name it right then too. It can be like across sessions that you can let it kind of brew for longer, and and then it can get named in a different way as well too. It might not be the initial thought or
and Teri Quatman brought in the concept of projective identification as well, which is a kind of advanced relational concept, but is worth touching on as well, because it just shows how muddy the soup can get, right? That we talk about transference, and transference is the idea of a kind of role or a structure of relating being projected onto us. And so that's often kind of explicitly communicated to us. The client will relate to us. It'll be embedded in how they talk to us or what they do, how they behave, how they relate. So we can often kind of see transference coming in a way, or at least there's data in the relationship that sort of holds that. Projective identification is the idea that we can project something into a person. And this is done unconsciously. And this is often done at a level where neither client nor therapist really knows what's going on. And this is more that we'll just feel a certain way about a client. We'll just have a feeling, often one that stays and sticks around and doesn't go away. And, you might reflect on the feeling, and it feels like you're feeling, but it actually reflects in some way the emotional world of the client. So this idea comes from the psychoanalytic theory of Melanie Klein, and has been elaborated over the years by other theorists. And she used it to describe the way that babies communicate their experience to their mothers, because babies don't have language, they lack a language. And so Klein is kind of positing that there's another way that experience can be communicated kind of subliminally between baby or infant and mother, and between people, right? So an example I might give of this is one I was sharing earlier during the prep with you guys. which is I've been working with a client for some time, and I started to notice like that every time I would have a session with them, I would have this feeling that the therapy was hurting them in some way. And this is something that I've sometimes felt before, right? Because I've talked about my struggles with countertransference around pacing. And so I have a vulnerability around that. Sometimes I can get sort of overly sensitive with patients because I know that I can put my foot on the gas too much. So sometimes I put the brakes on too much, right? Or I get tentative and anxious about putting the brakes on. So it felt a little bit like the feelings that I've had before in other experiences, but it just kept coming up. And I would explore with this person a little bit, like just, hey, how is this? How was that intervention? And there was this sort of the sense that just somehow the therapy was hurting them, no matter what kind of feedback I was receiving from them. And I started to process this with my supervisor more. And I'm sort of leaning into the idea now that this is probably a kind of projective identification, that maybe this was a kind of feeling that the patient was asking me to hold, that they couldn't hold within themselves. And it wasn't communicated explicitly, but it feels like my own feeling, but it maybe says something about their world, that they hold concerns about hurting other people, that they would be worried about, their strength being too much, right? And there's some clinical evidence within our process to support this. I'm holding it as a hypothesis. I think it's important, like, that we all spend a lot of time with our experiences and process them thoroughly and reference them back to the experiences of the client. So I don't want to say like definitively, yeah, this is it, but I feel like this is maybe an example. Like, I'm hypothesizing this could be an example of projective identification. I'm holding a feeling that feels like my own feeling, but it's the feeling of the client.
Yeah. Yeah. And as you were talking, I was reflecting with my own therapist too, and what dynamics could have been going on there? Because this feels so relevant for me, of like, if there was kind of this like wanting a rescuer kind of dynamic, and then if she felt a pull to match that projection in a way, because that's where it feels different than transference, that it occurs over a longer period of time with this concept. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. Like, I think going back to your experience, Emma, I think it's fair that without you even realizing it, you came to the therapy encounter in good faith, but that something of your personal history was sort of supplanted in the therapist. And I wonder if she knew what to do with that, right? A feeling that she had that was reflective of your reality.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like you said, something of the tremendous vulnerability that you carried, a feeling of needing to be rescued.
With projective identification, the client is also not aware of these emotions.
I would say so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think transference or projection, I should say, in the classical sense, is a little bit more accessible because there's an explicit reference. Projective identification is, I would say, harder. Based on what I'm reading, it's a lot harder to name. It involves an incredible emotional relationship with yourself and capacity to process your own experience, to be able to sort of
pick up on it.
Yeah. But things like, as a therapist, you'll find yourself relating to a client in a way that you don't normally relate to clients, or just feeling really off your game. And you're like, why did I keep saying that? Why did I keep doing that? I feel really weird, And I think, sometimes we go, oh yeah, like it's me. It's something that I'm doing. It's some personal countertransference on my part. And it takes a lot of time to appreciate, oh, actually, no, maybe this is something about, the client, right? And again, countertransference is data. One of the things I love about the person-centered frame is they don't really have an idea of countertransference, but their equivalent is empathy. Countertransference is empathy, right? If we're feeling something about a patient, that's, again, that says something about their reality, right? We use that as empathic data to help relate to them. So,
and it's the both of you, it's the third space again.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, I can think of times where the person seemed to have good social skills, was charming, but as I was working with them, I noticed over time that there was feelings of boredom, there was feelings of disgust at times, or an aversion or repulsion, as well as fear. And when I was getting supervision from and consulting from some really experienced therapists at the time, they said, oh, this is interesting. And when I shared more about what I knew about the client and everything, they're like, I wonder if you're dealing with a client that has some sociopathic tendencies that they're not even maybe aware of themselves. There's no formal diagnosis on here. But as I started working with them longer, that was kind of like a spark for me to being like, maybe there's something here. I don't want to pathologize them unwarrantedly or anything like this. But over time, it was clear that this was the case, right? And actually the client had really low insight. This is the way that they relate to people. But when you got deeper, well, there really wasn't a deeper part. You couldn't access a deeper part, right? And I don't know about you, but if somebody's telling a story that's very surface level, we're going to start yawning, we're going to start to get bored, right? But this was happening like all the time, right? And it was like an uncontrollable thing. And I started thinking that I was a bad therapist, right? Like, oh, I guess I'm not empathizing enough with this client, right? I'm just, I'm not a good enough therapist. And I was pretty new as well.
Right,
I think it was in
right.
the first year or two of being a therapist. And so I think it's just so important to really have good supervision and consulting around you with people with a variety of perspectives, and they have some significant experience, and not dismiss those feelings, right? Know that there's something there. It might not be, what we first jump to, right? I'd be careful with the first assumptions we jump to based on those feelings. But my temptation would have been just to dismiss those feelings kind of entirely. Like, I don't like these feelings. And my own dynamic too, being kind of a rescuer person and some struggles with codependence over time, would have been like, well, this must be something that I need to change. There's something about me not being a good enough therapist. And I don't know, maybe that example lands for people. Maybe that is projective identification. Maybe that's something different.
I think it's such a good example of
Okay.
very likely projective identification. I love that your experience is I wasn't empathetic enough. And my immediate thought was, no, you were too empathetic. You were so empathetic that you felt something of the client in yourself, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
indeed.
There's some really good examples in the analytic literature of intense countertransference and projective identification. One example is just analysts falling asleep in sessions. And it happens. Experienced, effective
Yes.
analysts fall
Yes.
asleep in sessions, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I love that example, like, because
Yeah.
it's showing how deeply you
Yeah.
can feel, right? And we
Yeah.
use that term sometimes, empath or highly sensitive person,
Yeah.
because some of us will feel things even deeper, than a person that may not be an empath. So it's very interesting and very important.
Yeah. Yeah. I think Yalom said something too about boredom, like that it's an important thing to regard. Like when you feel really bored in a session, it says something, right? And it's often not about us. It's about the way the client is relating to us. They're boring us, And
Yeah.
I don't say that, to sort of disparage the client, but I say that as in like they're keeping us out of something important. They're keeping us away from
Yes.
the topic that might enliven us.
And so much of it is communicated. I love that example from Klein that you gave, right? And as a parent of a toddler, and it's not that far back to think about
Yeah. Yeah.
my kiddo as a baby. It's all of these little micro expressions, right? So you have to be really good at understanding what we would say paraverbals, right? So these slight hesitations in speech, a furrowing of the brow, one thing on their own doesn't mean much, but when you combine it and when you see it over time, you'll start to pick up on patterns. Often, again, I was picking up on those things unaware. And then that was something that also helped me. The supervisor, who is very good at paraverbals, was saying like, well, pay attention to when you are asking a client that, something personal, or asking them about something particularly that might have some level of embarrassment or shame, or them being less than perfect, what their paraverbals are. Because with sociopathy in particular, there is a huge avoidance of shame. It's all about, and narcissism as well, right? Avoidance of that and wanting to protect from that, because they were likely very damaged at an early age, progressively around this. And yeah, so that's what I was experiencing, and that's what I saw over time. I had a hypothesis, right? This allowed me to develop a better hypothesis, and then it kind of was supported over time and let me work with the client better.
Yeah. A relational process, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
I love it, Richard. So maybe now that we've got these good concepts down and we've defined what it means to work relationally, we can talk more about the dangers and sort of return to Emma's experience. Because I know we've sort of reflected on this as part of our prep, and I'm just thinking about what you shared, Emma. And it's like, I think maybe you were exposed to every type of relational danger that we could name, in your experience. Like it's a rich example of ways that relational therapy can go wrong, because not unlike when we talked about psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, Richard, and it was really framed as like there's tremendous vulnerability but tremendous opportunities. I think in the relational frame it's the same way. This door is open, and that's great, but both good and bad can go through, right? So when we look at relating unwell, when we look at the dangers or the challenges, what comes to mind for you guys? Where are the pitfalls here?
First things that's coming to mind is like closeness. Like I'm just thinking with this counselor too, and if I was kind of backing away a bit, there'd be like oh, what's happening? Why aren't you letting me in? Like, can you let me in more? And just the psychic harm in that of like, no, I have a right to also private thoughts and privacy in that regard. So I think that can be one that feels like tricky because it's like, no, but we felt close and then you disappeared. So it can make sense to me on the therapist end of like, where'd you go a bit and trying to get back, and also of, hey, no, that's an appropriate relationship.
You have to watch the scene in The Matrix Resurrections with Neil Patrick Harris as the analyst.
Oh yeah.
I've never seen The Matrix, so tell me more.
So it's the newest one, right? A year or two ago it came out. And there's this dynamic of gaslighting that's going on in the context of seeming very relational, right? So when the client decides to, Reeves, right, decides to have a break from therapy, or I haven't seen you in a while, or you're not disclosing as much, that this is seen as a problem of the client. And sure, sometimes that could be the case. But in this case, it was signaling, it would signal to us as good, ethical therapists that perhaps it isn't a problem. Perhaps we have not created enough safety. And that indeed was why Keanu Reeves, Neo in it, decides to not be as vulnerable. It was actually the best thing for him to do would be to give himself distance and proximity. And at the same time, he's feeling incredible guilt and shame, being pretty directively put at him by the analyst.
That you made reference to it.
We got to get some pop culture in here.
And it was like that is like a relationship that he should have fled. It was
I'll have to watch it.
Not a safe relationship. I think one way of thinking about what you're talking about, Emma, that example is as countertransference of the therapist, right? That it evoked something in them when there wasn't a certain kind of emotional closeness expressed on your part, or a certain kind of willingness to disclose, like an openness, that they would have interpreted your reticence or ambivalence or even defensiveness as a problem, right? As like a liability in the relationship. And it might have struck a vulnerability on their part. I don't know.
Exactly.
I don't know because I don't know your therapist, so I don't want to speculate, but that's one way.
But likely that's the case. Yeah. And that is the huge risk of relational therapy, is that we have unmet needs that have not been processed, that now we are trying to get met by our clients, therefore not serving their best interest.
Yeah. It just makes me think too, someone was telling me about this recently, that I think AEDP, like on, I don't know if it's their official like Instagram page, like posted something and it was kind of like, oh, questions to ask clients. And I think it was like, I haven't seen it myself, so this is like third telephone, but that are like, oh, can you sense my care for you? How do you feel it in your body when you sense my care? And just like after my experience, I'm like, oh, this feels so invasive to me. So I'm like, I'm so curious the context and like what, because that feels really
because it has been violated, right? I use those.
How do you use it well? Tell me.
with ADP and other kind of trauma processing relational modalities. It's all about, as I kind of just mentioned, it's the frame of, do I know about what needs that I have that are met, unmet, that are, insecurities? And if I have good awareness of that and am meeting those in healthy ways, I'm very likely to not expect, there's really countertransference, expect my client to meet those. And I have ways of managing that and getting those needs met in healthy ways and preventing that dynamic from happening, which could otherwise damage the client. So if I've done that AED, for example, and when you're in that trauma processing phase and now trying to change dynamics, long held attachment dynamics, this requires so much of the therapist and so much constant awareness. And it can shift. I think there's times where as a therapist, I've been in alignment with all of that. And I could ask those questions, and it could be really powerful and transformative and certainly in the client's best interest. And then there's times where I'm asking that, and even a slightly, different tone, or the context is slightly different because maybe I'm unconsciously looking for something from the client, and this can create so much damage, right? I'm kind of theorizing here because I don't know
Yeah.
exactly.
I was gonna say, I think that's a good
Yeah.
sort of personal example, but I'm also thinking about if this is on the official
Mhm.
Instagram page, this is sort of representing the modality as a
This is.
whole. Yeah, and I sort of think about it as maybe fitting in more than to like one of the intersection of sort of the trauma informed stance and the relational stance, and
Mhm.
sort of some of the problems in the trauma informed position that, or the misinterpretations of the trauma informed
Yes,
position that
well
people
said, yeah.
make, where it's like, okay, being trauma informed means being really nice. It means, sort of
Mhm.
supporting vulnerability. And it means, relating to someone in a way where I bring all that warmth and nurturance that wasn't there for them before. Right. And there's this,
Reparenting.
yeah, exactly. And there's this idea that like, that's what we need to do as therapists. We sort of need to be the opposite of what our patients experienced, or we need to be what they lacked, which I think sort of has its own problems, right? Because again, it thinks about patients as sort of singular in their structure, as we think only about the wound. We don't think about the needs of the defense, right? And a lot of patients actually, I'm just like you, Emma. I find a too warm therapist like kind of gross. I don't relate well to that, because I need a therapist who embodies a kind of healthy neutrality, because there needs to be room for all the parts of me that hate intimacy, that feel threatened by it, all of the anger that I have, inside of me, all of the defensiveness around my wound. There needs to be room for that too, right? And so when we sort of like privilege vulnerability, we disparage defensiveness, and that's not really fair when defensiveness also makes up an essential and important part of who a person is. So relating is not just about relating to the vulnerability of the patient, it's also about relating to their defenses. And yeah, I think like we misinterpret this trauma informed position as only working in the interest of the vulnerability of the person. Another episode though.
I love that you brought up that question though from AADP, because it's how you ask it as well, right? Like there's so much work that I've would be doing with the client, and what was missing obviously in your therapeutic experience was boundaries, right? There would be so much boundaries. I'm so clear in my role. I'm so clear of trying to help the client understand that this is practice for the rest of their life, and that I'm not this person who's going to be available at 2 a.m. or any time, right? That this relationship is staying in here. And I also do bring, I think most of myself into the session, but there's so much work. And I think asking that question also is, if you're asking, okay, well, I'm supportive of you, and how does that feel for me to be, supportive of you, and that I care for you. It also tells us a lot about where the client is at too, right? So if defenses come up, I'm not going to be pushing further vulnerability. If their answer is, well, that's really hard to hear, or, ooh, that makes me icky, or I'm just seeing something non-verbally. Well, that is great, as Yolome would say, great grist for the mill for us to work on together, right? And not in a pushy way of like, there's something wrong about you for having this defense, but let's slow down and just understand what perhaps is going on here, and actually slow down the pace.
That's well said, Richard.
It's all about how you deal with it, how you ask it, all of the work that you've done before, during, after, the frame that you set, boundaries.
Yeah, that it's kind of like, okay, it's so situated in like the theoretical framework again, and it's not just like cherry picking.
Understandably, I'd be shocked, right? Like I think when I first encountered some things from AADP and some similar relational, like, and in some forms of self-disclosure, to maybe way outside of how I was originally trained on, going farther down the continuum. And again, a risky intervention, possibly some benefit if done really well, but it's all within the frame and the theory that you're in. And you could be using a technique, and we've talked about integration a little bit on a former episode, and using it in kind of this shotgun approach, detached from a solid foundation and you can cause some real damage. So looking at the context of the technique within a solid foundation of the person of the therapist and their practice and the theory is super important. Or yeah, of course, I'd be like, what the fuck is this?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I think too that like nurturance sells, you know, and like when ADP looks to advertise itself, like it's going to lean into its strengths, right? This is a marketing ploy, right? Like look at these questions that are embedded in our process. Aren't they lovely, profound, nurturing questions that support, you know, growth and healing? Like the selling point of the therapy is not the standing still, it's the movement, even if the standing still is just as important, you know. Who's going to go to a therapy that's like, yeah, we're not going to do anything to you. You can just stay where you are, you know, like you can just
Especially in
stand
our,
still.
and there's a good point again, especially
Yeah,
in our really high-paced,
yeah,
production outcome focused, particularly North American capitalist world.
yeah,
This is why one of the reasons why analysis has become decreasing in popularity. That was always the complaint was I'm sitting with the analyst for years and I feel like I'm not getting better. Maybe they actually are significantly getting better, but there's this
yeah,
idea that how could just the talking cure be working.
yeah, yeah. The just talking. Yeah, analysis doesn't do a good job of advertising itself because it's hard to advertise complexity, right? It's hard to advertise, but nurture and
And
sells.
it's not as the changes or the strive for the change, it's not as flashy and as apparent, right?
Yeah,
As at least
yeah,
theoretically
yeah,
behaviorism would state, right? So you just do this
sure.
here, practice this assertiveness technique, and this will help you with your confidence and help decrease your anxiety over time
Yeah,
through exposure. And like bing,
yeah,
bang, boom, very clear to explain, very clear to manualize. When it works, it's like, it looks like magic. It's really fast. For every case where that works, and I do use behavioral principles at times, there is, 10 other times where that is way too fast, way too much, way too quick, and actually potentially damaging, or I'm ignoring a lot about the person and the richness of their lives and the function. We talk about this a lot, right? The function that symptom serves. So as I've learned more about relational and psychodynamic, psychoanalytic work and existential work, etc., I've slowed down a lot. So I will still use behavioral techniques, but there is a very different context and flavor to them.
yeah. I think you're saying attunement is at the center of everything you do, and that guide is what interventions you choose.
Thanks for clarifying that. I couldn't word it so
Yeah.
well myself.
No, but I mean, you're, you know, again,
I agree
you're
with that.
speaking to the relational qualities that you embody, Richard, right? That you start with attunement, with really good attunement. I listen to the client, I let them touch me,
Mhm.
and I use that satellite
Yeah.
dish data to know what to say and when to say it. There's a couple of more pitfalls that are worth
Yeah.
mentioning. Another one is the idea of therapists relating very casually with patients.
Yep.
Mm.
That, you know,
Go and
we're sort of
surf in with the
increasing,
patients. It's
yeah,
kind of the
that
idea.
whether it's unique to that therapist and they have difficulty sort of embodying a frame, or whether it's sort of like, I think we do live in a more casual
Yeah.
atmosphere now where, you know, there's this kind of critique of the traditional psychotherapeutic frame. Like there's this idea that we should drop the power imbalance,
Mhm.
you know, that we don't need it, right? That we don't need to differentiate ourselves from the client, or that the relationship can kind of go both ways. And I think that that's ripe for the kind of transgressions that you experienced, Emma, right? Like when therapeutic relationships become more like friends. I've heard from clients too, just
Yeah.
as another example, and then Emma, I really want to get your thoughts on this. But like I've heard from other clients too of like other therapists they've worked with, and you know they just email with their therapist casually, or they're like, oh yeah, we're friends now, we were therapists, but
Yeah.
and now we're just friends and we hang out, and you know, or they emailed me and were like, hey, haven't seen you for a session for a while, do you want to come in for a session? And just like, you know, they're not maintaining any type of, you know, sort of professional and ethical structure, that the relationship has become sort of very casual, and I think that poses some problems.
And it's
Yeah.
interesting that for such a long time, seeing a therapist was seen as a shameful thing, and it still is in some circles. But with, maybe millennials, but then even following that, Gen Z, etc., it's seen as this cool thing, right? There's a lot of this play in in pop culture, this kind of trope of, oh, yeah, I went to see my therapist today, and yeah, we hung out at the bar or we went surfing. And there's a difference a little bit too. Even I have friends and colleagues and family on the East Coast, and that's something that they'll kind of make fun of about the West Coast. And it makes sense because there was a lot of, relational, but also kind of experimental kind of relational therapies you think about, and great work happened there as well, like the Esalen Institute, but also like counterculture, hippie movement, etc. And
Right.
therapy was, infused into all of that, right? And some famous therapists into all of that. And yeah, it's just really interesting to see how that dynamic now has shifted.
Sure. It's
Yeah.
very, very casual. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Or it just makes me think too of like in the queer community as well. Like it can be quite small, and especially if you work like with a lot of people, like same members of a similar like community, of just how that can be tricky, or like, yeah, maintaining those boundaries and
Sure,
yeah.
sure.
But again, yeah, something where just be like, okay, yeah, we're gonna run into each other and have that conversation of, I'm not going to approach you. How do you, if anyone asks how we know each other, if you say hi. But it's
Yeah.
tricky, those overlapping relationships.
Absolutely.
You wanna-
Yeah.
right.
Dual relationships. Yeah. And I think that sort of speaks to like you're saying the sort of the challenge of maintaining two positions with someone, right? How do I be this one type of person, be more like a function, like your
Mhm.
analyst described, versus have a relationship with them sort of outside the therapy?
Peripherally, kind
Yeah,
of,
peripherally.
you
Yeah,
might
yeah.
see me in a different context.
For sure. I think one of the other challenges of this for therapists is that maintaining a frame is work, because at the center of a therapeutic frame is anxiety for
Mhm.
both the patient and the therapist, because it means something could happen. When we structure our relationships in a certain way, it means something real can happen for the client. And by virtue of the fact that we stay really close to the client, for us too, right? And that is hard.
Yeah.
There's vulnerability and therefore anxiety in it. So it's easier to be a friend. It's easier to just be real casual with your client and to talk about nothing than to do the real work that involves you setting boundaries and maintaining maybe a certain neutrality and professional anonymity, and sort of holding the client to talking about themselves, and disclosing what's going on inside of them and bringing something to the therapy. I think I slam dunked that one, didn't I?
Well, the one thought I was just having though, like it's really interesting, like for me, advertising myself as like a queer therapist, and then sometimes there will be more self-disclosure in that too, and then that can create a camaraderie. I'm just thinking about of like,
Right.
okay, we have a similar lived experience, and for some people it's like, okay, that feels a bit safer. Like I want to like
Right.
start with the queer therapy. So yeah, it's interesting the gray areas and the nuances of like, where's the line again?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That you're saying this is the clientele that you'd want to attract, or maybe that like by sharing this detail, certain clientele will feel safer with you.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. If they're like seeking a queer therapist.
Yeah. I think it just becomes a question of where you draw the line. It's
Exactly.
there's no hard place for that. But like, do you allow enough anonymity in yourself, or do you maintain yourself enough as a function that the anxiety of the client can be the center of the process, right? Like, I'm just sort of asking these hypotheticals, Emma, but it's like, yeah, where are you betraying that if you are,
Yeah.
and is saying I'm queer, so that could be safer for you. Like, is that really betraying it? I don't know. Like, I think it makes sense to me. Like, I think what you're saying makes sense. Yeah, from a professional sense.
Yeah.
Good segue into self-disclosure, though.
Mhm.
Another important, sort of relational pitfall. Us talking about ourselves in sessions. The other day, I was meeting with a client, and he was mentioning his PC, and I also build PCs, and I disclosed that. And I don't know, I'm still thinking about it.
What are your thoughts? What do you think about it?
It was a casual move, Yeah.
Mhm.
I think ultimately I was able to maintain the frame, but there's something to process there, like in the moment, I was having a hard time maintaining that. And this felt like a move that allowed me to drop out of myself a little bit. I think to go a little deeper with this. This is a patient I've only met a few times, but they're in a very, very difficult situation with their health. And so there's a lot of anxiety inside of them around this. And I think it's difficult for them to talk about. We can talk about it, but it's very, very difficult. And so staying out of that is helpful. And I think I was feeling all of that we were sort of in this peripheral space around the issue. and feeling all of that anxiety and feeling it in myself. I'm in the soup, we're talking about the soup, right? And just in the moment went, okay, I can't hold this pressure in myself. So I'm going to just go to the casual topic, even share my thoughts a little bit, just because the pressure really is so big for both of us. Yeah, it sort of felt like too hard to maintain. It seems like a benign thing, and it is. I mean, I don't think it actually was ultimately transgressive, So I don't want to suggest that like saying, hey, yeah, I also am into DIY PCs was a problem, because like ultimately we were able to talk about something related to the client, and like I was a function, if
and
you
also
will.
like, I don't know, it
Yeah.
feels like this moment to like humanness too, when it's like, wow, I feel disconnected because I'm going through this huge experience and there's just so much. I don't know.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, yeah, like I don't want to read into it like and to problematize it too much. What I think it does though is it changes the structure of the relationship. And so it creates the possibility for the relationship, for the frame to dissolve and for the relationship to move in a different direction. It's just a good thing to be aware of, I think, right?
Of like, where did that come from for me?
Yeah.
What was
Yeah.
going on?
Yeah.
Yeah. Was that actually, yeah.
I don't want to dunk on myself for self-disclosing, but
Yeah.
I also don't want to go easy on myself for self-disclosing. And I think that's the trend increasingly that we talk. I've said to both of you often about my experience with one therapist where I felt like self-disclosure was his primary intervention and how crazy that drove me, right? Like just that I felt like I was lost. I wasn't at the center of the process because his attention was constantly on himself and he was constantly bringing himself into the process. So it was harmful in a way. Yeah.
It's interesting. It just makes me think of my training in like mentalization based therapy too, and how there can be a bit more of the self-disclosure as well, like for specific populations too, like where there's a lot of like psychic equivalents of, I think that other people are thinking the exact same way that I'm thinking. So like in that concept of mentalizing, that sometimes there'll be like little self-disclosures, but it could even be like, oh, you made that as a salad? What did you put in it? I've done this before, kind of thing. So like where that can actually be like, okay, we're in this as humans and you're seeing me as a full human and not just like this function. Like, so it's wild just how many different approaches to it too there are.
Yeah. I think I take a more conservative approach, and I'm definitely open increasingly to perspectives that allow for some self-disclosure, but I'm guarded. Richard, I know you're in a different position. Emma, I want to know from you though, and I want to hear from Richard too about his position, but I want to know from you, what was it like to receive self-disclosure from your therapist that you worked with? How was that?
Ooh. Well, I think for parts of me, it feels so like, I don't know, it's the feeling of like being in elementary school and like a teacher disclosing something, and then you're like, wow, I get this special information. So for the parts of me that are like, I feel like an exception, but that's also where it can become dangerous too. And then some other times it was like, yeah, this just isn't about me. I wanted to focus on something about me, and it feels like we moved away. Yeah. Yeah.
Like my experience, you felt lost or sort of dismissed by self-disclosure sometimes.
Yeah. Maybe once or twice it was like, oh no, that felt like a well-timed self-disclosure too. Like I think, yeah.
I've experienced that with my therapist too. Like the therapist that I worked with for many years, like instances of self-disclosure that felt helpful. So I know they exist.
Yeah. You err on the side of caution, but you're like, I've seen it.
Do any come to mind for either of you when it felt right or good or helpful?
Well, for me, it was, sorry, Emma, I interrupted
No, you go. I'm still thinking.
Okay. For me, I had a real breakthrough. Like I had a real breakthrough moment of tremendous grief and realization and insight. Big session, you might say, big session. And at the end, my therapist, because I was done processing, that's for sure. A lot came up. I was done processing. And at the end, my therapist just sort of shared, you know what? I just want you to know I have gone through a similar experience. I have sort of a similar history to you. I've dealt with a similar thing. And that it felt okay. It didn't feel intrusive. It felt humanizing. I'm sort of grateful to know that about my therapist. And it did sort of facilitate a feeling of safety in our relationship. Like, okay, I think this guy's going to get me. Yeah. So, a more benign or supportive instance of self-disclosure.
Yeah, mine was quite similar as well. I think it was something of like a lot of shame and isolation, and then kind of the me too in it. It was like, okay, that felt, yeah.
Yeah, I sort of get interested on the other type of experience you had, which was the one of sort of excitement or a feeling of specialness that came with self-disclosure.
Yeah.
And I sort of wonder if there was a defensive function in that for you. that if knowing something special about your therapist sort of restructured in the relationship in a way that allowed you less anxiety or afforded you less anxiety in yourself. Like, do you think that's a fair interpretation?
Oh yeah. Oh, 100%. Because with the Lacan therapist now, I'm like, oh, I don't get it. Like this was
You
so
don't get the
vulnerable.
specialness. Yeah.
And I yeah. Yeah, slam dunk to that one.
And
Yeah.
do you think
Yeah.
that was that maybe one of the big issues there with your past therapist? Not just self-disclosure in general, but perhaps she was treating you different than she was other patients.
Well, I guess we don't know that part.
What was your, we will maybe never know that part, but what was your feeling? Do you have any gut instinct about that?
I'm sure to an extent, I imagine, for certain things. Like I feel like, yeah, again, with the projective identification, I think, yeah.
I'm sort of wondering, was it the norm for your therapist to self-disclose so much, or is maybe part of why they tripped up or blundered relationally so much a result of that, right? Of your of without you even realizing it, you implanting a need for specialness,
Yes.
a kind of projective identification around that. Is that too bold of an interpretation to make, Emma?
You could check out.
Okay,
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
It speaks to the complexity of this, doesn't it?
It's so hard. Yeah.
Yeah,
No, because
man.
I'm just thinking of self-disclosures for myself. Like I think I had a client just once out of nowhere was talking about smoking weed and was like, do you smoke weed? And I just said, yes. And I'm like, why did I? But it just so I'm like, I really like I've done a lot of poor self-disclosures too.
Right.
Yeah.
I want to hear Richard's thoughts though, because Richard, you have a different
I'm more
position. You're
on
more
the
liberal.
far end of the continuum. I
Yeah,
do
yeah.
use self-disclosure quite a bit. I work with a lot of teens. I've always worked with a lot of youth, children and youth and young adults. And learning how to be good at self-disclosure is important because, so for example, I'll have sessions with really complex traumatized youth. I remember one client who did not say anything, would not say a word for 6 sessions. So, and so my gut was, and also receiving some supervision. Of course, my supervisor at that time too was very high in kind of that relational area and pretty high in self-disclosure as well. And a lot of experience working with you. So I trusted them, and I lean towards just kind of sharing, how difficult it is to go to therapy, and also my difficulties, as a young adult trying to get into the therapy room and all of the shame and different things that prevent people from going in, and from men from going in, being a male, and from some of the family, living in lower socioeconomic conditions, etc. This client really needed to know that I had some understanding of their world, and they certainly weren't giving anything back to me, but I knew enough from their file and the little pieces that they shared, and from their previous therapist also, where there was the team confidentiality, that I could just share that I had a sense a little bit of what was going on in their world. So I shared the parts of my life that were relevant to them. And over time, this allowed them to see, like, okay, this guy is legit, right? This guy has been through some things. He understands that this is hard and there's suffering, and that he's not just sitting there in a suit, judging me. And so particularly with youth, there's a lot of talk in literature around adolescence of the authenticity, right? And that they, certainly for youth that are coming in that maybe have not had good attachment figures, there's been a lot of emotional neglect, etc., that they're not used to having, but what they really want and need, right, is to be, they're not used to a lot of vulnerability from adults. They don't even believe that it's possible. They're in dynamics where adults, what the role of an adult is to dictate things to them and to kind of control their lives and to assert power and kind of take away their choice. So leaning in those moments towards a higher level of self-disclosure has been really helpful, and has made me, and that's not my only tool, again, to, as maybe that one therapist Glenn was discussing, that would be troublesome for that to be the only tool. But it can be very strategic in helping normalize things and shame reducing to clients if done well, and if it's in their best interest, right? And at least if our hypothesis is that, kind of share this thing that I believe is going to lead to better connection, to reducing shame, to creating, now I've lowered the power dynamic so that they feel more vulnerable, so that they don't think I'm just, another authority figure judging them.
That's a good example of self-disclosure, Richard. I really like that one. Yeah. In the interest of safety, right? And engagement and connection. I think a lot about this story that Kim Barthel told me. She told a lot of people about it, but she would reference it a lot. But I guess for a time she worked up north, like in the Northwest Territories, I think, as a therapist. She's an occupational therapist that sort of has a vested interest in working with trauma and is sort of leaning heavily into the world of psychology. I think for a time, though, she did work as a therapist. I'm not sure if it was in an OT capacity or more of a counseling capacity. She told me, though, about this client that she worked with for some time. And every time he would come to the session, he would say nothing the entire session. And he looked really depressed, like he was really not doing well. And she really struggled for this for a while. Like she just didn't really know what to say to him or how to relate to what he was bringing to the session. But eventually she started to just talk to him, and she would just talk about herself, and she would tell him about her life. And she just, she filled the sessions basically. And not in, I don't think, like a malicious or harmful way or anything. It was just he wasn't going to say anything. And so she was like, well, I'll just tell you about myself, and like what's going on for me and stuff. Right. And I think they worked together for like 6 months or something. And she said, like, he didn't say like anything the entire time. Like nothing happened. And then she tells me like 5 or 10 years later or something, she's in an airport in the airport in Winnipeg, and she's walking through the airport. And this guy walks up to her, no joke. And he goes, hey, I remember you. Do you remember me? And she went, yeah, I do remember you. And he went, I just want you to know you saved my life. Those sessions saved my life. I was going to kill myself. And coming and just listening to you talk about yourself every day kept me alive, kept me going. Right. So she references that for a lot of different reasons because she's a wonderful educator and stuff. But I just think there's another example of, self-disclosure. I, learn something new every day, right? Got to modify our radical positions sometimes. There's always a counterexample. Well, I think maybe we should look to sort of wrap up by maybe just talking about what we can learn from Emma, from your example, and sort of what in general goes into relating well, right? Like if we're going to do this type of therapy, what do we need, right, to be able to do it well? Because there's real risks, right? Like we're talking about, real harm can happen. And I think, you're like, there's other even more significant examples, sexual transgressions, violent transgressions amongst therapists, right? Like real problems that can happen in the therapeutic relationship. So the stakes are high, right? But like, what do we need to hold to be able to do this well? What do you guys think?
Well, supervision, I'm just thinking for me of like everything of like, why am I doing what I'm doing? What's my intention? How come it's looking different for this client than this client? Is that actually based in what they're needing? Or is this something, my own stuff coming up?
100%.
That's, the biggest one for me.
Like we're talking about how muddy and soupy this countertransference, transference, projective identification stuff gets. I think we need help to differentiate it. I'm not getting enough supervision. It bugs me, but I can't get enough supervision, right? It's just so tremendously helpful. But supervision in a relational frame. So I think supervision that supports you looking inward, supervision that maybe operates in the same dynamics that you would structure your own therapy process, right? That leaves you to sort of grapple with your own experience and the attendant anxiety that comes along with that. I know, like in my practicum, when I had more intensive supervision, my first supervisor that I worked with was very relational, and I benefited a lot. And it was like often we'd have whole sessions where we never talked about my clients. We would just talk about me. But that, somehow that made a difference and translated and was more relevant in some ways, right? Dealing with my own stuff that was coming up and what I was experiencing. So yeah. Sorry, I'm just really riffing off what you said, Emma. It's so valuable.
No, it's all great.
Yeah,
Richard, you're
no.
you're a supervisor. So like I'm sure you have something to say about this too.
Yeah, well, I think we're not meant to be islands to ourselves. So newer therapists, and I can think about students, graduate school students graduating, that it's very rare where we would kind of support them to go into, private practice fully. We would much rather them go into group practice or go into agency work or for a while, right, before doing private practice, because there's still that independence can be very isolating. So it can lead to burnout, but also it can lead to, not having people to kind of check your ethics and check your competencies. And I also, do support, I think, certain new graduates or people into fairly independent practice, and it doesn't have to look like a typical kind of group practice, but it's about our support network that we create around ourselves. Are they part of a consultation group? Do they have a network of colleagues that they're connecting with? Are they vulnerable enough to connect with these people? I think even for experienced therapists as well, practicing for many years, they'll also discuss how isolating it can be to do private practice. That there's, I understand, there's some great freedom and everything like that. But for myself, I shifted out of doing private practice into it's kind of that great mix of a collective. So therapists are having their own businesses, their own business names, etc., all of that. But we get together regularly to consult with each other. And yeah, I also provide supervision for therapists. And yeah, it can look like a lot of different things, right? Supervision, consultation, but the lack of that good support network. And we're expecting, we're hoping clients will build these relationships in their lives, and then we don't model it ourselves. We don't do it ourselves. I think it's a bit ridiculous.
Agreed. Emma, do you get supervision? Do you have a supervisor?
I have a couple different ones.
Okay. Yeah. Good.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's really good.
Yeah. A thought I had too is just sometimes of also bringing in those client cases where it feels like, oh no, things are going fine here. There's nothing to talk about. Cause I feel like sometimes then there's,
Those are sometimes the most important ones to
definitely.
talk about. Yeah. Such a good example. Yeah. What else do we need? We talked about boundaries.
Yeah, we mentioned it. I think it's 3 or 4 times, all in a row here on this plan. So obviously that's important.
Yeah. I think sort of going back to our discussion on the casualness of things, that we need to be guarded against that in some ways, right? That, yeah, sure, there is a too rigid professionalism that we can embody where we lose our humanity. But it is important that we structure our relationship in a certain way, right? A way that prioritizes the needs and experience of the client, a way that, keeps our own stuff out of the relationship as much as possible, a way that allows a degree of anonymity that supports our safety and the safety of the client as well, right? I don't know. That's sort of my initial thoughts. Yeah.
I think
we need a frame.
I think in general, regardless of what modality you're coming from, and that maybe connects to wider things even beyond boundaries, but boundaries are in there, of ethics, of using things like the CPA or CCCC, ethical decision-making frameworks, right? So using that a lot more, this idea of kind of self-supervision and using that as much as it's oh yeah, I know my ethics and all of this. Well, every time I actually use it, and I was just going through this with a supervisee of mine the other day, and you will miss things, right, if you don't do it, because there's a reason why it's in the order that it's in. And every time I do it, I'll notice that there's something that I've missed, right? So for example, it might be that the, decision to contact, another person in the family to bring them into kind of a family therapy. So for the client to contact them, right, whatever the dynamic is. And it might seem oh yeah, this is a simple thing, the client is asking for this, they're wanting this, oh, I'm trained in family therapy. But to slow things down for a second, and I think I learn a lot from my supervisees too, because I'm forced to kind of slow down because they're presenting these issues, right? So it keeps me a good therapist as well, so I get a benefit as well. And going through those things oh, what if this actually is not appropriate? What if actually, what seems so simple creates a dynamic where this client who has particular attachment issues now is feeling that, they've lost me kind of as their main ally, and, they can't, whatever, right? There's just so many different pieces that need to be considered. And so going slow and going through those steps, I think, is really important. I think sometimes one other thing I'll say about this is that ethics can be a very cognitive and kind of legalistic thing. And I think that's very unfortunate. It becomes kind of don't go against this ethics code, ethics principle number, blah, 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 says this. And it's such a narrow way of thinking about ethics. And I've been influenced a lot by some reading more lately in virtues ethics. So thinking about how each decision, does that lead me closer to the kind of person that I strive to be, as well as the kind of person that, my wife, my son, my close relationships would hopefully see me as, or does this decision take me further away? And connected to that too, there's a great book, The Ethics of Caring by Kalia Taylor, that's used a lot now in the curriculums for any psychedelic assisted therapy programs. And that's this idea of relational ethics. So I'm really checking in somatically, I'm checking in relationally, kind of as those questions I mentioned, emotionally, really slowing down and checking things from even more angles than I think we traditionally would be taught. So that helps us have better bound, right? That almost by being like, oh, I might have to deal with the discomfort, or the client might have to deal with the discomfort that I won't give them an answer right now. For example, whether I could, add this additional family member into therapy, and it seems just like no nonsense, common sense or something, that being comfortable and saying, oh, actually, hold on, wait, I need to think about that, right? Setting that boundary there to follow a process.
These principles that we follow are in some ways, they are the frame. They provide the basic structure, the foundation of the frame, whatever you want to call it, right? Yeah. I think I can speak for Emma and I, because we went to the same program. I think we had a pretty good education in ethics.
That's great.
I think Linda did a pretty good job. Yeah, she taught it in the dynamic fashion that you're talking
That's
about.
wonderful to hear.
Lots of gray, more of a process, constant process of reflection, always exceptions. We got leveraged those rural and remote scenarios all the time, which always confounded an orthodox position, right? You'd think you knew your ethics, and then
go live in northern BC. It will challenge
exactly,
all of
and then it changes everything.
Yes.
Yeah. Another thing coming to mind for me about relating well is actually, it's not so much in the interest of avoiding pitfalls as it is just in supporting relational effectiveness, because that's maybe something we haven't talked about as much as we could this episode. We've really looked at the dangers, but it's like we practice this way for a reason, and we practice it because it helps people and it works well and it supports people in growing in a way that maybe other therapy modalities miss. And so it's just the idea of sort of showing, not telling. I think one of the things that people who are unfamiliar or feel tentative about working in a relational space do is they learn about a relational concept, but rather than sort of embodying it or using it in a way that structures an experience for a client, they just sort of tell a client about it. So I feel like there were examples of that in your
yes
in what you shared,
giving
Emma,
some
that like
psychoeducation instead of actually
that's right, or
living it out.
That your therapist would sort of tell you what a healthy relationship looked like, or would sort of tell you how she was going to be there with you, but not actually show you what that was like, right? Or sort of embody the experience. So,
because maybe, and again, I don't know that this person, but it's possible that some therapists may not, because we're wounded healers, right? They may not know themselves what that looks like. So it's easy to recite from a book versus actually live it out.
Actually doing it, and having the experience. But I think, Richard and I, I think we both come from an experiential frame. We see therapy as more than just, again, this information exchange, as just thinking about things, but as actually really, really experiencing something.
Yeah, and it's that in relational, it's this idea of creating a corrective emotional experience, right? That there is things that were not met in the original attachment, and there was these ruptures and neglects, and now we have a chance for those needs to be met if done well.
Again, with the boundary of it's not another parent relationship, it's kind of first time having that safety in a way that should have been.
It's more about restructuring the relationship within the client, like with themselves, I think, right? They use our relationship to do that, or we sort of lend our relationship as a vehicle to do that. But ultimately, it's not our relationship which is the important one. It's the client's relationship with themselves, which is what heals.
Yeah, right? They know it's now possible to have a good relationship, or to finally be, for example, maybe assert their needs and not be dismissed, right? And
so it's just important for us to see our role for what it is. It's a temporary relationship. It's a relationship that is used and then it's discarded once the client's relationship is sort of in a better place. And so ultimately that's the relationship we should be most concerned about, is the client's relationship with themselves.
That's what I say to my students, that we're doing the best job if we're working ourselves out of a job.
Yeah, for sure, right? Well, Emma, I sort of want you to spend maybe the last couple of minutes talking to us about the new therapy experience you're in. You alluded earlier to working now with the Lacanian analysis.
Maybe the polar opposite.
Very different. And probably a lot of our listeners won't really know much about Jacques Lacan or his, position in psychoanalysis. And that's maybe a whole other episode, or untouchable in some ways. But I do want to know about what it's like and how it's different. I think what you've told me so far is it seems to be going well and you're getting a lot out of it. So
no, it's so interesting. It's so different because since Lacan, I always
Lacan, I think it's Lacan.
Is
Yeah.
it? Okay, Lacan.
Jacques Lacan. Yeah.
Okay, since he's kind of an offshoot of like Freud.
Mhm.
Yeah, classic Freud. Yeah, like for her walking in, like I just walked in and I was kind of like, oh, sorry, I'm like ran here. And I was like chit-chatting a bit and she just kind of pointed at the chair. And then I just sat down. I was like, oh, okay, we're not doing okay. Yeah. So the anxiety was high. That was there, which is necessary. Yeah. Yeah, it's just everything, like the boundaries are just so clear. Like even like the finances too, like they were negotiated, like everything was talked about of like, okay, there's a sliding scale and you should be paying something that like you're investing in this, like it shouldn't like hurt you, but like there should be an investment. And so like it started there for like, okay, the processing and then what comes up around money too, and like the symbolic nature of money and what's my experience with it. And yeah, just conversations where I'm like, I wouldn't even think to have this. Like I just set my right and I'm like, oh, sometimes I have for a sliding scale if it fits, but I'm just like, there's just like, it just feels like everything has been dissected so far that's come up. And yeah, just that Lacanian, it's very like centered around like the words you use and kind of like building your like internal map based on your language and like kind of creating your inner world in that way. So for her, she probably says like 5 words throughout the entire session. Like we'll just like, either repeat something I said or something that's like, oh, you said or like this sounded like this word, and then I'll like go off on a stream of consciousness about that. And then it's fascinating. It's just so different. And
It sounds like there's a good strong frame there.
Yeah, but interesting that it feels so different, but then it's still relational in a way. Like it's like she gives so little, but I can still
That's right.
feel her holding it, which I think I was expecting like, oh no, I'm gonna feel so cut off. You're the blank slate.
Nice big satellite dish. You're still being received.
Yeah. Oh, and I loved at the beginning too, she said, like, just so you're aware, you're gonna love me, you're gonna hate me, like every emotion's gonna come up towards me. I was like, oh, that's a good thing to say to at the beginning of like,
sure. Normalize transference.
And bring it in, talk about it.
Expose it. Well, I'm happy that you're having a very different experience now, and it sounds like a safe one.
It's interesting.
Well, I think that brings us to the end of this episode, Emma. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing all that you did tonight. I think this was really, really awesome to discuss, and I hope interesting for our listeners too.
Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks, you too.
We hope you enjoyed the podcast and are a little wiser for it.
Thanks for listening.